two silences enter the same space, and they are not the same silence. That is the first honest thing to say about this specific dynamic, the one where both people have withdrawn, where contact has ceased from both directions, where the particular absence that no contact creates has settled over a connection that was, in its active phase, anything but quiet. The surface looks identical from the outside. Two people, no contact. The absence of the reaching that was previously the ambient condition of the dynamic. The quiet that follows the end of whatever form the active phase took. But underneath the identical surface, two entirely different interior experiences are happening simultaneously. Two different relationships to the silence. Two different qualities of what the no contact means, what produced it, what it is doing in the interior of each person. The empath's no contact and the avoidant's no contact are not the same event wearing the same name. The empath's no contact arrives after something has been exhausted. Not the love. The love tends to persist, in some form, longer than the capacity to keep reaching. But something else. The specific, finite, genuinely limited resource of the hope that kept the reaching going. The particular quality of believing that one more gesture, one more extension of warmth, one more patient waiting through the distance would eventually produce the reciprocity that the connection was always pointing toward. That resource has a limit. Most empaths do not know where the limit is until they have reached it. Spend significant time in the dynamic without being able to locate the threshold in advance, without being able to say, I will stop reaching when this specific condition is met. The stopping tends not to work that way. It tends to arrive when the resource simply runs out. When the internal asking of whether to reach one more time is met with the honest answer that there is nothing left to reach with. The empath's no contact is the honest expression of that depletion, not a strategy, not the deliberate deployment of withdrawal as the final move in a dynamic whose rules have been mastered. The genuine, arrived at, this is simply what is true ending of the reaching, because the reaching has nothing left sustaining it. That quality, the depleted quality, the genuine rather than strategic quality, is what makes the empath's no contact different from every previous instance of distance in the dynamic. The previous distances were temporary, were the empath creating space but maintaining orientation, were the pauses between reaches rather than the ending of the reaching. This is different. The orientation has changed, not toward the avoidance direction, toward the empath's own interior, toward the life that was there throughout and was receiving less than its full share of the empath's considerable attention and care. The avoidance no contact arrives from a different place entirely. In most cases, the avoidance no contact is not no contact in the same sense, is the continuation, at increased intensity, of the distance that the avoidance pattern was already producing in the active phase of the dynamic. The silence is not new. The withdrawal is not new. What is new is that the empath is no longer filling the silence with their own reaching, is no longer compensating for the withdrawal with the consistent warmth of their own continued orientation. The avoidance no contact is the pattern continuing. The empath's no contact is the pattern being refused. Those are fundamentally different things happening at the same time. What happens next depends on where each person actually is in their own interior process when the mutual silence settles. For the empath, the immediate aftermath of the mutual no contact tends to have a specific quality that is distinct from the earlier phases of the dynamic. A quality of genuine stillness that the active dynamic was not capable of producing. Not the forced stillness of someone who is managing the impulse to reach. The genuine stillness of someone whose impulse has, for the time being, genuinely quieted. The impulse quieting is not the same as the feeling disappearing. The empath may still feel the love, may still feel the specific quality of missing the avoidant, in the particular, named, this person specifically way that genuine connection tends to produce when it is absent. The feeling is not switched off by the no contact. But the impulse to act on the feeling, to reach, to extend, to maintain the connection through the quality of consistent orientation, that has genuinely quieted. And in the quieting of that impulse, something becomes available to the empath that the active dynamic was preventing: space. Not the performed space of someone who is creating distance strategically, the genuine space of an interior that is no longer perpetually organized around the management of someone else's availability as its primary concern. That space is where the empath begins to encounter themselves again, not dramatically, in the ordinary, unremarkable, gradually more available way of someone whose attention is returning from its long outward direction to the interior that was always there, always worth attending to, always the primary location of what actually needs the empath's care and presence. For the avoidant, the immediate aftermath of the mutual no contact tends to run the sequence that has been described in previous scripts. The relief first, the specific exhale of a nervous system that has been under the pressure of genuine connection and has now, in the silence of mutual no contact, found the conditions of reduced pressure. But the relief phase in the mutual no contact has a different quality than the relief that followed previous instances of the avoidant creating distance while the empath maintained orientation. Because this time, the silence is mutual. The empath is not maintaining orientation in the background, is not providing the quiet, regulatory, this person is still genuinely present toward me reassurance that the previous distance is preserved, even as the avoidant withdrew. The relief arrives in conditions of actual absence rather than managed distance. And actual absence is a different condition for the avoidance interior than managed distance. Managed distance had the empath's continued presence as its backdrop. The avoidant could withdraw and still feel, in whatever precognitive way these things are felt, the warmth of someone genuinely oriented toward them in the background. The distance was comfortable, partly because it was not real distance. It was the space the avoidant created while the empath's presence continued providing the regulatory floor that made the defended life manageable. Actual absence removes the floor. The removal of the floor is what produces the specific quality of what happens next for the avoidant when the no contact is genuinely mutual, the going crazy that has been described in previous scripts. But in the mutual no contact, the going crazy has a quality that differs from the going crazy that follows the empath's unilateral silence. When the empath goes silent and the avoidant has not initiated mutual no contact, the avoidance system has the option, however imperfectly it tends to exercise it, of controlled approach, of the thin-reasoned contact, of maintaining some version of peripheral engagement with the orbit of the empath's life, even in the absence of direct contact. When the no contact is genuinely mutual, when the avoidant's own withdrawal has contributed to the silence, rather than being the response to the empath's withdrawal, those options carry a different weight. The controlled approach is more complicated when the avoidant's own behavior contributed to the conditions that produced the mutual silence. The peripheral engagement is harder to maintain when the avoidant cannot straightforwardly position themselves as the one reaching back toward the empath. The mutual no contact creates conditions of more genuine symmetry than the dynamic in its active phase ever produced. Both people silent, both people in their own interior process, neither one providing the other with the ambient quality of their continued orientation as the regulatory background of the dynamic. And in those conditions of genuine symmetry, the avoidance interior has less available cover, less of the managed distance while the empath maintains connection comfort that allowed the pattern to continue without the full cost being felt. More of the direct, unmediated, this is what the defended life actually produces without someone else compensating, contact with the actual conditions of the interior. What the actual conditions of the interior contain, without the compensation, is the honest experience of the avoidant's own life as it is being lived. The defended life, the self-sufficiency, the independence that was always the narrative and was always, to some degree, the genuine expression of a person who had organized themselves around not needing, and also, present, persisting, refusing to be managed into the adequately small category that the narrative would prefer, the specific, named, directional quality of missing the empath. Not generic loneliness, the particular person, The particular quality of what was present in the dynamic when it was most honest. The particular ordinary moments, including any version of the self-forgetfulness described in the previous script, that established themselves in the interior as genuine impression before the defense could prevent the establishing. The missing is there, real. In the mutual no contact, it is not cushioned by the regulatory comfort of the empath's continued orientation. It is simply there, in the interior, in the actual conditions of two people who are both silent, and both in their own process, and neither one providing the other with the background presence that made the active dynamic's costs more manageable. The question of what happens next is genuinely open in the mutual no contact, in a way that is different from the empath's unilateral silence. In the empath's unilateral silence, the asymmetry of the situation created a kind of pressure that pointed in a specific direction, toward the avoidant eventually responding to the loss of the empath's orientation with some form of reaching back, however managed or genuine. In the mutual no contact, both people are in the silence simultaneously. Both are in their own process. The pressure is not pointing in a single direction. It is present in both interiors, producing different experiences, requiring different responses. For the empath, the mutual no contact confirms something that the empath's own unilateral silence had begun to produce: the genuine return of orientation toward their own interior. In the mutual silence, there is less of the ambient awareness of the avoidant's orientation toward the connection, because the avoidant is also in no contact. Less of the background wondering about whether the avoidant's silence is the managed distance of someone who is still peripherally engaged, or the genuine absence of someone who has moved on. The mutual silence settles something. Not definitively. The interior processes of both people are still ongoing, but enough that the empath's own process has cleaner conditions in which to continue. The empath in the mutual no contact tends to find the return to themselves proceeding more organically than in the conditions of the empath's unilateral silence, because the mutual silence removes the specific, ongoing distraction of the peripheral awareness of the avoidant's continued presence in the orbit of the connection. Both people are genuinely elsewhere, and the empath, with both people genuinely elsewhere, has less of the ambient pull of the avoidant's nearby presence to navigate. The genuine question of the mutual no contact is not what happens to the dynamic. That question is genuinely secondary. The genuine question is what each person does with the conditions the mutual silence creates. The empath has the conditions of genuine return, of the interior space that the ceased reaching produces, of the life that becomes available to be fully inhabited when the reaching is no longer consuming the resources that the inhabitation requires. The avoidant has the conditions of genuine reckoning, of the floor's removal, of the direct contact with the interior's actual conditions without the compensating presence of the empath's consistent orientation, making those conditions more comfortable than they actually are. Both people have the conditions most conducive to genuine development, not as a gift the dynamic bestowed, as the natural consequence of two people who have both, for their own genuine reasons, arrived at the silence simultaneously. What they do with the conditions is theirs alone. The empath's life waits for no one, is already being returned to, in the genuine, forward-moving, completely inhabitable quality of someone whose attention is coming home, to the ordinary days that are the whole of it. The mutual silence settles differently in each person over time. That is worth examining honestly, rather than moving quickly past it toward the more dramatic territory of what the silence eventually produces. Because the settling is where most of the actual work happens, not in the acute phase of the mutual no contact's arrival, not in the immediate this is different quality of both people being simultaneously in the silence for the first time, but in the days and weeks that follow, in the ordinary, unremarkable, nobody is watching texture of two people who are each alone with their own interior in the specific conditions of genuine mutual absence. The settling looks different in each person, because what is settling is different. For the empath, the settling is the gradual, non-linear return to the genuine rhythm of their own life. The specific, incremental, day-by-day process of a self whose attention is genuinely coming home, rather than being forced home through the effortful suppression of the outward orientation. The difference between those two things, between the attention genuinely returning and the attention being managed back, is felt in the quality of the settling. Genuine return has a quality of ease underneath the grief, an increasing availability to the actual content of the actual days that does not require fighting the pull of the outward direction, because the pull has genuinely reduced. This is not to say the grief is absent. The grief is real. The empath in the mutual no contact is grieving something genuine, the specific, irreplaceable quality of what was present in the connection when it was most honest, the particular person, the particular moments, the vision of what the connection was always trying to become and never quite managed to become in the conditions the dynamic was providing. That grief is present in the settling, moving through at its own pace, sometimes more acute, sometimes less, sometimes arriving without obvious trigger in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable day. But the grief and the returning rhythm coexist. The grief does not prevent the returning. The returning does not suppress the grief. They are simply both present, the honest expression of a person who is genuinely moving through a genuine loss, while simultaneously genuinely returning to a genuine life. For the avoidant, the settling is more turbulent. This is the honest account of it, and it deserves honest language rather than the softening that compassion sometimes introduces. The avoidant settling is not the gradual ease underneath the grief return of someone whose interior was ready to come home. It is the specific, uncomfortable, not finding adequate footing process of someone whose interior was organized around conditions that no longer exist and has not yet developed a stable relationship with the conditions that do. The conditions that no longer exist were the empath's presence, not as an acknowledged resource, the narrative rarely acknowledged it as such, but as the functional reality, the regulatory floor, the quiet, ambient, not requiring acknowledgement quality of someone genuinely oriented toward the avoidant that was providing more interior stability than the defended self-sufficiency narrative was crediting it with. The conditions that do exist are the actual interior without that floor. The defended life in its actual, uncompensated, this is what it produces without someone else carrying part of its cost conditions. And those conditions are, in the honest experience of someone encountering them directly for possibly the first time, considerably less comfortable than the narrative was suggesting. The turbulence of the avoidant settling is not the same as growth. It is the direct experience of the pattern's actual cost. Important to feel, not automatically transformative in its feeling. The feeling of the cost is the necessary precondition for genuine motivation to change. It is not the change itself, and the distinction between those two things matters for what comes after. There is a specific thing that happens in the mutual no contact that does not happen when only one person has withdrawn. Something that the symmetry of both people being simultaneously silent produces in a way that the asymmetrical dynamics of the active phase never could. Both people are, for the first time, genuinely alone with the actual question of what they want. In the active dynamic, the question was always somewhat distorted by the conditions. The empath's wanting was influenced by the hope, by the specific, forward-leaning, this could become quality of a connection that had genuine potential, and was always showing enough of that potential to keep the wanting organized around the possibility of its becoming. The wanting was real, but it was wanting in the context of active engagement, of ongoing investment, of the dynamic still being a live question. The avoidance wanting was organized around the management of it, around the specific, effortful project of keeping the wanting from becoming visible, from becoming the kind of openly expressed desire that the architecture was built to prevent. The wanting was real, but it existed inside the container of the management, which was always shaping how the wanting could express itself and what forms of expression were available to it. In the mutual no contact, both of those distortions are at least partially removed. The empath is not wanting in the context of ongoing investment in a live connection. The wanting now exists in the actual absence, in the conditions of genuine distance, rather than the conditions of active hoping. This tends to clarify the wanting, rather than amplify it. Tends to produce a more honest assessment of what is actually wanted, rather than what the hope was constructing from the connection's genuine potential. The avoidance wanting exists, for perhaps the first time, outside the container of its management. Not because the management has ceased, the management is still operational, but because the conditions in which the management was running have changed enough that the management's usual efficiency is reduced. The empath is not present for the management to manage the avoidance wanting in relation to. The dynamic is not active for the management to regulate the avoidance engagement within. The wanting is simply there, in the interior, with less of the external relational context that the management was using as its operating environment. Both people, then, have cleaner access to what they actually want than the active dynamic was providing. Not perfect access. The distortions of grief and relief and the various management forms are still operating, but cleaner, more genuinely their own, less shaped by the specific conditions of the active dynamic's ongoing emotional weather. What each person tends to find when they encounter the question with cleaner access is worth examining honestly. The empath tends to find something that surprises them. Not the revelation that they want the avoidant. That wanting has been established and is not particularly surprising, but the specific quality of what they want, which turns out, in the cleaner conditions of the mutual no contact, to be more precise than the active dynamics conditions were allowing it to be. What the empath wants is not the avoidant as they were in the dynamic, not the avoidant who was managing the connection while the empath maintained it, not the avoidant whose interior love was genuine and whose behavioral expression was insufficient, not the version of the connection that existed in the active dynamic with its characteristic asymmetry and its characteristic cost. What the empath wants is the version that the connection was always pointing toward without being able to produce, the mutual, reciprocal, warmth as baseline, ordinary days showing up version. The version that required both people to be genuinely present, rather than one person compensating for the other's managed absence. That distinction between wanting the avoidant as they were and wanting the version of genuine mutual connection that the avoidant represented as a possibility rather than a reality is significant. It is the distinction between wanting to return to the dynamic and wanting something genuinely different, between the backward-looking hope of restoring what was and the forward-looking recognition of what would need to be true for the wanting to be genuinely fulfilled. The empath, in the cleaner conditions of the mutual no contact, tends to arrive at this distinction with more clarity than the active dynamic was permitting. Tends to understand more precisely that the wanting is for the genuine version rather than the managed approximation, and that the genuine version is only available if the avoidant has done the work that would close the gap between their interior and their behavioral expression. The avoidant tends to find something different when they encounter the question with cleaner access. They tend to find that the wanting is more real and more specific than the management was representing it as, that the missing has a quality that goes beyond the generic discomfort of a changed routine or the loss of a pleasant connection, that the specific person, their specific qualities, their specific quality of presence, the particular ordinary moments that establish themselves in the interior as genuine impression, is the object of the wanting in a way that makes generic substitution inadequate. This discovery tends to produce one of the responses that has been described throughout this conversation. Either the genuine confrontation with the question of adequacy, the honest, self-implicating recognition that wanting something and being willing to become adequate to it are different things, and that the current gap between interior and behavioral expression is not a small gap, but the entire territory of the pattern's cost, or the management finding new forms. The new forms are worth naming because they appear in the mutual no contact with specific characteristics. The controlled approach, previously described, tends in the mutual no contact to take on a quality of greater urgency than it had in the active dynamic. Because the empath's genuine absence, the specific, mutual, both people are really not here quality of actual no contact, makes the controlled approach feel, to the avoidant, like a more significant act than the thin recent contact of the active dynamics management, which it is, and which is also still, if it is motivated primarily by the acute discomfort of the wanting pressing against the management rather than by genuine interior development, the controlled approach. Still the managed version. Still the reaching that has enough architecture around it to prevent the full exposure of genuine vulnerability. The empath receives the controlled approach, if it comes, from the cleaner position that the mutual no contact produced, from the more precise understanding of what they want, from the honest knowledge that the wanting is for the genuine version rather than the managed approximation. That cleaner position allows a cleaner reception. Not the hope-inflated reception of the active dynamic, where the controlled approach could be read as the beginning of genuine change, because the wanting made generous interpretation the available option. Not the hurt-deflated reception that would dismiss the genuine feeling the controlled approach reflects. The honest reception. The one that acknowledges the genuine feeling the approach expresses, and holds it alongside the honest question of whether it represents genuine interior development or the acute management of discomfort. The ordinary days will tell. They have always been the place where the answer lives. The mutual no contact does not change that, does not produce the answer in the acute phase, simply creates the conditions, cleaner than the active dynamic, more genuinely symmetrical, less organized around the compensation that the empath's consistent orientation was providing, in which the honest assessment becomes possible. If the approach comes from genuine development, if the work has been done, if the gap is genuinely closing, if the showing up that follows will be sustained through the ordinary conditions, rather than concentrated in the motivated moments, the ordinary days will show it. If the approach comes from the managed wanting of the acute phase, if the motivation is the discomfort of the mutual silence rather than the genuine interior development, the ordinary days will show that too. Either way, the empath has what they need to receive it honestly. The cleaner position of someone who knows what they want, who understands the distinction between what was and what would need to be, who is genuinely inhabiting their own life in the mutual silence, rather than organizing that life around the question of the avoidant's next move, and who will receive whatever comes next, the approach or the continued silence, from the grounded, self-complete, clearly seeing position of someone whose own interior is genuinely their own, not organized around the outcome, simply present to it, warmly, clearly, without desperation, and without the portion held in reserve for someone else's becoming. All of it here, all of it present, in the genuine life. That was always the point.